a pleasure to be here. I have made this trip to Morris several times to work with the USDA Center up there as a number of different parts of that. So it is a pleasure to be up here. I always enjoy that drive. I see different fields along the way. I'm always interested in how they've changed over time, positively and negatively. I have a number of fields that I look at across the Midwest that I just kind of track mentally and everything else. But it is a pleasure to be here. And if you were here this afternoon, you may have had positive and negative reactions to what I told you, but I'm going to take that up a notch this evening and give you some challenges to think about, because Mike asked me to talk about the future of crop production and agriculture, changes on the landscape, things that we need to be starting to think about in agriculture that really are going to take us to the next level. And I'm just going to take you back a little bit. When Norman Borlaug was around, he produced the Green Revolution. And that was really about how do we combine genetics, how do we begin to put fertility with that. It's really marked in terms of being able to use that to produce food for the whole world. But we now face the need for another agricultural revolution. And it's a revolution in terms of not only how we manage nitrogen, how we manage crops, how do we begin to look at that. So I'm going to take you through that story. And you can have all sorts of different reactions to this as we go along, but it's my intent to make you think about agriculture from a different perspective as we go along. So if you were new this evening and everything, here's my contact information and everything else. Feel free to email me. You can call me and everything else, and we'll get back to you. I have ongoing dialogues. I've had ongoing dialogues with producers for 30 years in terms of some of the dynamics that we've been doing and everything. So don't feel that you're imposing if you send me an email and everything else, because I do enjoy these conversations. All right, so now I'm going to tell you that we need to have a new mindset. When you have a new mindset about agriculture, we need to begin thinking about it from a different perspective on all of this. And so I'm going to introduce you to a really complex diagram. And this complex diagram, and let's think about it through the center, because here's what we do in agriculture. We take those resources, carbon dioxide, water, nutrients, all of those things, and we put it through a system, whether it be a grain, a forage, a tree, a strawberry, a blueberry, marijuana. One of my favorite magazines to get is I actually am on the mailing list for cannabis, and it's really intriguing. They had an interesting article this last 2 issues ago on water use efficiency in cannabis. And that was really very exciting to me, because I've spent my whole career working on water use efficiency. The only disappointing part is I didn't write the article. So, but we take that and we begin to look at this in terms of what we put it through. We combine it with different management systems, and we produce things. We produce quality and we produce quantity out of this. But those are wrapped in a dynamic, and we talk about the spatial variation, where we put things on the landscape. We talk about the temporal variation, what the weather's doing, what the climate trends are doing, what timing of operations there are, and all of this. But we wrap that around all of this thing called an ecosystem. And those four things that are on the side out there are all the ecosystem services. Ecosystem services in terms of provisioning, what we produce, regulating, in terms of climate, and the feedbacks of agriculture into the climate regime, what we can do in terms of mitigation, the question in terms of diseases, insects, and weeds, water quality, soil quality, all play into that regulating piece. We've got supporting, that's the pollinator habitat that we have going on. Nutrient cycling is a regulatory piece of this, and then we've got the cultural. And agriculture does have a cultural benefit. So So the mindset that I want you to start thinking about is that we need to get away from the primary objective of agriculture has always been thought to be in the provisioning side. But in reality, the new mindset is that we've got to put it into the context of ecosystem services. If we want to go forward, we're really going to have to look at agriculture from the idea that it's not just about what we produce, but the environmental quality piece of that, from the regulating side, what we do in terms of landscape, in terms of other habitats, pollinator habitats, and for sure, and even how society views agriculture. It's going to tax us to start thinking this way, because that's not the traditional way we've thought about agriculture. As we go forward, and we just looked at a different piece of this, the United States is actually one of the lower publishing countries, in terms of discussing the multifunctionality of agriculture and ecosystem services of all the literature that's published in the world. It's not a mindset that we have in American agriculture. Europe is way ahead of us, Australia is way ahead of us, Brazil and Argentina are ahead of us in terms of really thinking about how agriculture fits into the ecosystem. And the United States is way down on that. Very kind of shocking in all of this. So we think about all this different aspects of agriculture and how do we begin to look at this. Going to put it in the context of this cropping distribution that we have across the United States, and I just used corn and soybeans, is that if you look at that map 10 years ago, North Dakota, South Dakota weren't quite as green as they are today. We have pushed the Corn Belt north and west. We pushed it very dramatically into that region. All these different things, we see the shifts in here, we can do the things, maybe we tweak. We spend a lot of time looking at how do cropping patterns change not only in the United States, but how they've been changing around the world in terms of all the responses that are going on. So we just did a little analysis. It's very intrigued us into when that pushed into north and west, what was really happening in North Dakota and South Dakota. So these are the three eastern cropping districts in North Dakota and South Dakota. The green line is other crops. The purple line is corn, and the kind of brownish line is soybeans. And you look across North Dakota and South Dakota, northeastern cropping district in North Dakota is just now catching up. They've really had very little corn and soybeans until the recent piece, and they've really begun to move in there. Interestingly enough, we always thought, gee, we'd push that corn belt up there. In reality, it's the soybeans that have come into that more than corn. And because if you look at that purple line in the southern, or the eastern cropping districts of South Dakota, it's actually increased. We've got a lot of corn in there, but it's mixed with different parts of the system. But those counties, or those cropping districts right now are 80% corn and soybeans. They're as intense, almost as intense as Iowa, we're 87%. Here's the impacts. We've seen a dramatic increase in the flashiness of rivers in those two states. We've seen an increase in sediment load going down those two states. We've seen a number of negative environmental impacts because we've now taken hay out of that rotation. We've taken wheat out of that rotation. We've taken sunflower out of the rotation. We have simplified the crop rotation system. I was in Wisconsin giving a talk in early January, actually early February. And one of the producers came up to me and says, you know, Wisconsin has gone through the Iowification of cropping. I said, what do you mean Iowification? He says, because we've now basically produced corn and soybeans across Wisconsin. And he said, I don't think that's a good thing. So producers are beginning to realize that maybe the simplification of cropping systems are not the future for us in terms of some of these dynamics. Here's the things that changed, and while we went back and we've done a lot more than just create these 6 graphs. We really looked at all of this. Here's the things that caused that change to happen. The environment, North Dakota and South Dakota, because of climate, we've gotten warmer, we've gotten wetter. Annual precipitation has gone up, so that we produce those crops out there. You've got management practices, and a lot of that practice in North Dakota and South Dakota is under no-till. A lot of conservation tillage makes very good use of snow trapping, getting that water back into the soil. Cover crops have gone into a few places in Red River Valley. The genetics, here's a big piece in terms of going to shorter season varieties, cold and drought tolerance in a lot of this. So genetics has played a role in terms of this, herbicide resistance, in terms of all this. The social aspect, it's really, a lot of that land is now rented. So we're ending up with renter management, larger farm size, a lot of these different pieces. Post-harvest, it was really driven a lot by higher market prices, increased biofuel demands, and crop insurance and subsidies have played a big role in a shift to this. I'll give you your trivia for the night. The top 2 crop insurance claims across the Midwest are excessive moisture and drought. If some farmers could really try to claim that in the same field. The rules kind of prevent that. But those account for $12 billion in insurance outlays since the 1980s. If we would have invested that same amount of money into improving our soils and improving conservation, we'd have an entirely different farming dynamic. Because those 2 claims are within our management capabilities to improve our soils. We have the excessive moisture because we don't have the infiltration into our soils. We get a lot of runoff, we get a lot of puddling, a number of different things that happen. We get the drought because our soils are poor and they don't have the water holding capacity. So we end up with seeing those same things occurring for different reasons, but they can be cured by proper soil management along with this aspect. Here's another diagram. It's some of our long-term studies that we have going on from, actually these are dated from 2006 through 2018 now. The typical corn soybean system across the Midwest loses 1,000 pounds of carbon per acre per year. You farm 40 years, you've lost 20 tons of carbon out of that soil. The bad news is, if there's badder news than what I just gave you, the bad news is that this is the standard cropping practice across the Midwest. We need to get carbon back into the system, and we need to figure out how to incentivize this. Because when we really think about this, and I gave you that example this afternoon in terms of these dynamics, is that there is a real value to carbon. And the value of carbon is to that farming operation in terms of stabilizing productivity and a number of different things. One of the things that frustrates me across the Midwest is that when we talk about conservation tillage, and we talk about all these different things, I get a lot of pushback on that because people say, well, if you go to no-till, you go to strip till, those conservation practices are no yield. These soils have to be tilled across the Midwest. If I had it with my wherewithal, I would fire that scientist that told me that, but I can't do that. I mean, that's the mindset that we have, that we've got to do different things. And so when we see all of this, the future really is about how do we value carbon, water, and so on. how do we begin to look at those three basic elements going into a crop production system? How do we use them the most efficiently in all of this? We have a prairie system that we actually have the same instrumentation over a prairie system. We see that that always has a positive carbon balance. Here's the good news. We have this series of fields. We have another series of fields that we've converted to a cover crop no-till field. Within 1 year, we went from a negative carbon balance to a positive carbon balance because we didn't till. Don Mikowski will tell you that over and over again, that tillage is the biggest part. Not only does it evaporate water, but it evaporates carbon back out of it. That's what you can think about that. So the future of farming, the future of agriculture, is really how do we think about how soil and how we manage that soil fits into it. Because your future depends on it. Our future depends on it in terms of being able to efficiently produce crops along the way. Here's that same field that I showed you before in terms of these dynamics, all these different pieces that are going on. But here's the real piece of this. The simplification of our cropping patterns is going to have to change. We're going to have to get diversity on this landscape for all the ecosystem services. We have this continued decrease in soil organic matter. What that does is that basically increases our reliance on inputs and increases our susceptibility to weather variation. As water quality impacts, as soil quality impacts. If you look at this overall piece of this puzzle, give you one example out of the Raccoon River. Raccoon River is the poster child for nitrate movement into river supplies. Raccoon River is what supplies the city of Des Moines for its drinking water supply. A couple years ago, there was a lawsuit between Des Moines Water Works and 3 counties in Iowa that's been dismissed, but that doesn't mean the problem's gone away. So we were asked in the early or the mid-2000s by L.D. McMullen at that time, who was the manager of the water district, to say, what are these trends in nitrate looking like? Because there were times that he was taxing the nitrate removal plant. They have a reverse osmosis system to begin to remove the nitrates out there, and their water utilities are always concerned about, is that going to be of sufficient capacity, or do I need to plan to expand that if the nitrate levels continue to go? But what's the root cause of this? What's the root cause of this? So we went through, that's a 2.5 million acre watershed, so it's not something really small. So we went through that watershed and we began to look at the dynamics of what was going on. We actually analyzed all the nitrogen fertilizer use. We handled animal use, manure use, all these different things were happening in that watershed. It wasn't about nitrogen. Those nitrate levels were going up even though nitrogen applications in that watershed have been relatively stable since 1980. They go up and down a little bit each year, but that wasn't the root cause of this. We actually have less manure going on that watershed now than we had before, because we've shifted where animals are produced. The biggest factor related to the change in nitrates within the watershed was that graph on the right. And that's the distribution of small grains and hay. When we took small grains and hay out of that rotation is when the nitrates started increasing. When we simplified the rotations of the watershed, nitrates started going up. And there's a couple different reasons. They're going up because we changed the water balance. We had a major shift in how that system used water. We didn't have any crops taking up water early in the spring. And so that water has to go somewhere, so it leaches down through. Nitrate's very mobile with water. And USGS also found that in that Raccoon River, in that period of time, that their base flow had increased as well. The base flow increased in proportion to when we were changing the cropping patterns. We're going to have to understand that agricultural systems have a major impact on our water balance in very large areas. They have an impact on our water quality in very large areas. And if we want to protect that, we're going to have to think differently about the system. We also have done other analyses. These are nitrate levels. This is the role in which cover crops can play. The bigger those circles at the bottom, those little blue circles, the higher the nitrate values. We start getting up north. We just got a limited growing season for that. So cover crops may not be the answer once we move farther north. We may have to think about how do we diversify that rotation in order to get there. If you look at all this, here's another good piece of this. Have lots of labor. We've actually sampled fields at 150 feet by 150 foot grid down to 5 feet. And every one of those cores gets divided into 6-inch increments. We know these fields forwards and backwards in all of this. But here's the change. Just want to show you the dramatic change when we went from a conventional till to a strip till with a cover crop. We doubled the microbial biomass within a 2-year period. We can change the soil, and we can change it very quickly. It's a matter of how do we think about this system from an entirely different perspective in all of this. So here's the opportunities in the Midwest. We have the potential to grow lots of different crops. You realize that most of the pumpkins that go into cans for Thanksgiving are produced in central Illinois? Realize that we produce a lot of blueberries in the Midwest? We produce a lot of asparagus in Michigan. We produce a lot of crops and have the potential to produce a lot of different crops across the Midwest. One of the pushbacks is where's the market for them? I think we're going to have to think about how do we cultivate those markets along the way. We have to start looking beyond the provisioning aspect to consider a broader view of agriculture. Policy is going to have to help us get there in terms of how do we look at the dynamics of all this. I do a lot of interactions with Australian producers. Australian producers will say, you know, if we had your soils, the world would be limitless. They consider American producers very lazy. I always took offense to that until I started thinking about it. Is that if you look at Australian producers, they really do look at their system in a much different way in terms of how do they take advantage to a very poor soil, a very variable climate, reduced amount of inputs, no subsidies, and they yet make a profit on each one of those farms. And they really value the quality of that produce going in. Wheat in particular, wheat and rice that they produce in Australia is sold into the Southeastern Asian market. Has real demand on premium of quality, so they spend a lot of time on that. They look beyond just what they produced at the farm gate to really put the value into it. And they value a different way of looking at our system, and we're going to have to start thinking agriculturally that way. We're going to have to get diverse rotations that allow this coping with this changing climate. Climate is changing. The unfortunate part is it's changed for the last 10,000 years since we've been producing in agriculture, but we are at a point now in which the variation of climate is unlike anything we have seen. And the projections aren't real positive. It's not going to settle down anytime soon. So it says that for agriculture, we're going to have to figure out how do we cope with this changing climate. This increasing variability with more extremes. How many people have seen a spring like this spring? (2020) could be on the opposite end in terms of being dry. Realize that we've already had 6 $1 billion weather events this year. And we're only in July. So we could have some real economic impacts to this. So our opportunities in the Midwest and the future of crop production and the future of agriculture is really to start thinking differently about this system. How do we think differently about our agricultural complex? How do we think differently about the different dynamics that are going on? I go back to this diagram because we're going to have to start thinking in much broader terms. Just give you another example. I was doing an interview with the New York Times the other day because she was very fascinated about New York's program on carbon farming. So I'll do the interview, but we're going to have to, you have to have a lesson from me before we do the interview. I said you need to change your whole thought process because all agriculture is in the carbon farming business. What do? We take carbon dioxide out of the air, put it through the process of photosynthesis, put it into either forages, grain, a number of different things. So we are all in agriculture in the carbon farming business. It's just a matter of whether you're positive or negative at the end of the year on your balance. She goes, oh, I've never thought about agriculture from that perspective. She was only thinking about carbon from just one small slice of that puzzle. So she really kind of changed her whole attitude on this. And I think we've got to work with the public on what we mean and how they, and the cultural aspects of this, in terms of getting society to understand what agriculture is all about and where their food is coming from and the fragile nature of our food production systems. That variation that we see in production around the world. Groups that are paying most attention to this, we did a lot of interactions with the Department of Defense. More wars are fought over the lack of food than anything else. Followed by the lack of water. So food security really becomes an entirely different issue when we begin to think about these dynamics. So how do we produce, what do we produce, all these different things? Just to put a little different diagram to this, if we, that lower right-hand corner, we tend to value provisioning. That's a center block of all of this. But if we get any force that's along with that, we take that completely out of balance. So we're going to have to start looking at that regulating piece, the supporting piece, the cultural piece, all as part of the system, because that will allow us to balance our agriculture. And it doesn't teeter as much. It doesn't respond to those changes that are dynamic as we go along the way. So here's the landscapes, and I just threw out one picture. I pulled this up in NRCS. You know, when we start thinking about landscapes instead of farming to that ditch that's out there, can we use other parts of that landscape for different things, for pollinator habitat, a number of different things to work with that. The only thing that's wrong with that slide is that there's a row of weeds along that grass strip. That's not pollinator habitat, that's weed pressures. So we got to think about how we manage that as part of it. But our future is really about how we rethink agriculture. How do we begin to rethink agriculture from the dynamics of water, carbon, nutrients, sunlight, those raw materials that we put through and produce something. It's a matter of what do we put that through to capture that value out of it. So with that, I'll entertain some questions. I'm sure there's one or two.
I like a leading question.
Oh, you like it?
So this afternoon you talked about minimum
high temperatures and the impact to corn. Can you give a few more farmers in the audience? I think it would be important to mention there.
Okay. Yeah, for you who aren't here this afternoon, I'll go through this. Things that we see that influence production, why we see the yield variation going on, is not just about water. We see that maximum temperatures in July are a major impact, minimum temperatures in August. And under the climate regime that we're under in terms of the changing climate, minimum temperatures are increasing more than maximum temperatures. In fact, across Iowa, maximum temperatures in the summer are actually going down a little bit. Minimums are going up a whole lot. Physiologically, that has a tremendous impact on plants, because August minimum temperatures, when they're really high, increase the respiration at night. The same instrumentation that you see in there, we have another set of instrumentation that allows us to actually look at what happens within the canopy. These really hot nights, where you get down to about 75, 80 degrees at night, those really warm, nice, muggy nights. What we see is we basically, all the photosynthate that we produce during that last day, we respire at night. And when you respire all of at night, you have nothing left to put into the ground. And it really does diminish our capacity to produce a crop. We see that shortens and it hastens senescence, so it hastens the rate of maturity. And so we end up shortening the grain filling period, a number of different things. And so we're spending a lot of time looking at what is the impact of high nighttime temperatures. And how do we begin to have to shift that cropping system to be able to do that? I'll give you one example of this just to follow on. We've done a lot of analysis across the Midwest. We extend into Kentucky looking at this. One of the things that we saw is that we have some really low yields in both corn and soybeans in Kentucky on really poor soils because they've been degraded over time with the cultural operations that have gone on. Corn is no longer profitable in a lot of counties in Kentucky, so they've switched to wheat. They've switched to wheat because you can grow that and get it mature before that dry period in August begins to set in. So you see those shifts that are occurring. It was facilitated because the state of Kentucky also put in the money to make a flour mill, to create a market. And I think that's maybe what we have to do in other things. So other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So in view of your work with the IPCC and other reports, I'm wondering if you could speak to so for instance, Minnesota's greenhouse gas inventory omits a large amount of soil emissions, which you were saying that tilling is one of the biggest culprits of emissions, particularly nitrous oxide. So I'm wondering if you could speak to what you think drives that and whether you think it's detrimental to your work.
Okay. I'll shorten the question for you than anything. It's basically, how do we look at the soil component of the greenhouse gas inventory, both from a CO2 perspective, methane perspective, and a nitrous oxide perspective? CO2 coming out of the soil is basically a culprit of how we till that soil. CO2 emission out of soil is a natural process. The more biology we put into that soil, they're aerobic organisms. What do? You take in oxygen, you give off CO2. Microbes, fungi within the soil do that same thing. They're giving off some CO2 as well. That's just the natural occurrence. The good news is that what we found is that during a growing canopy, that CO2 that's emitted in there is sucked right back up by the plant. It rarely reaches the top of that canopy. So it's very efficient in terms of taking it up. Corn in particular. Soybeans, if you got narrow rows, that CO2 is never reaching out into the atmosphere. So we're just recycling it that way. Nitrous oxide is really a function of how nitrogen is managed in there, but it's a little more complex than that. It's complex because it is related to the soil water dynamics within it. If we can improve soil structure so that we have more air going into that soil and we don't go to those saturated conditions as much, we reduce the nitrous oxide very, very quickly. The other thing we can do with nitrous oxide is basically go to forms of fertilizer and stabilize nitrogen that is then made more readily when that plant really is taking it up. We end up with a lot of nitrous oxide because of the way we do fertilizer management. We're putting it on in part of the time in which soils are wet, this spring, they're very saturated. We end up putting that out. It's only about 3% of the total nitrogen that goes up with nitrous oxide, but still, from an atmospheric standpoint, that's very, very large. But we have the capacity to solve the nitrous oxide emission problem by changing forms of fertilizer, changing timing, improving our soils and everything else, and we see those reduced very, very rapidly. And it makes the efficient use, but it also improves the efficiency of that plant to take up nitrogen as well. So, greenhouse gas inventories, that's actually whole volume 10 of that IPCC report. It's really interesting reading. It only has 85 equations. You know, a lot of different things of computing everything from cows to chickens to hogs, manure, the whole works. If you look at all that, the bottom line is that the greenhouse gases and everything is how do we begin to think about bringing those into control by our management practices. And they're well within our capabilities. They're not things that are unsolvable. They really are solvable, and they're quickly solvable. And the neat thing is the things that we do to reduce those have a positive benefit on agriculture, positive benefit on production.
One more quick question.
One more quick question. So it has to be a true or false question. Yes, sir.
To get to the future that you're talking about, do you need to counter the climate change skeptics? And if so, how do you go about doing that?
I better repeat the question. I'm just deciding how to phrase it. It won't get me in trouble. You know, basically, it's when you think about all this, how do we get past the climate change skeptics? When we think about the future of agriculture, how do you get past the climate change deniers, the climate change skeptics? I'm going to give you a little vignette on this. You'll find it amusing. I was giving a talk a few years ago after the 2008 National Climate Assessment came out. I was also a lead author on that agricultural section as well. So I was giving a talk to the Cattlemen's Association, and they're not the biggest climate change fans. I happened to be third on the program. There were two ladies ahead of me that were going through all the different climate change dynamics and all of this. And these guys were beating up on these two ladies. I almost felt sorry for them in terms of this. But I got up and all of this, I said, you realize that one of the things that's changing under this changing climate regime that we have is that this rising CO2 level is actually decreasing the protein in that grass that's out there. Which in the long term means that you're going to have less capacity to stock animals on that land. And they go, this is a problem. We got to solve this problem. So sometimes it's a matter of how it gets presented to the people that are not big fans of it. I have yet to run into a producer across the Midwest that says that what's changing out there. 2020 or 19 is a perfect example because we've shown that increasing seasonality of precipitation will move more to the spring. And we've had more wet springs lately than we've ever had before. And so they're very concerned about how do I farm under this increasing variability that we're going through. And so, yeah, they may not use the word climate change, but they recognize that things are changing that are negatively impacting their system. And it's a matter of taking those opportunities and going with it. And I'm still alive. 50-some talks a year to the producer. So that wasn't a short, quick answer.